Well,
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And beside me is my good friend John Henry, who's the preacher at the Church of Christ at St. Leon's in St. Leon, Indiana. And we are the hosts of this program, and our endeavor is to teach God's Word and to glorify Him in the things that we say and do. If you have any questions or comments in regards to the program, you will be given that opportunity at the end of the program, information where you can contact us with those questions and comments. And you'll also see that there are schedules in reference to the times of worship where John preaches and where I preach. And we would certainly welcome you if you came and visit with us if you have that opportunity. And so we would look forward to such things. And again, if you have any family or friends that would be interested in a program like this, let them know about it, because it's 7 o'clock every Thursday evening, and so we would certainly welcome them. We'd also like to say that you'll be given the opportunity to subscribe to the program, and so we encourage you to do that as well. As we have been studying in connection to God's Word, we've been going through the scheme of redemption, or God's plan to redeem man, and we ended our discussion right in chapter 15 in our last session. And we were talking about the song that was sung by Moses, who led them in the singing after their victory over the Egyptian army that God had given them and led them to salvation from their oppressors. And now what we're beginning to look at is really they're traveling down, going through the wilderness. And we're going to see different crises come up in this travel, John, and we're going to look at their attitude, and it really just says a lot about how fickle we can be,
right.
If we're not careful and thinking properly and having to
Sure.
unlearn some things to learn properly.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I want to begin reading in verse 23 of chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. It says, "And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the water of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. And said, If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee which I have brought upon Egypt, or upon the Egyptians. For I am the Lord that healeth thee. And they came to Elim, where were 12 wells of water, and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters." And so we learn in verse 24 that the people are out here once again. They're murmuring and complaining because they evidently feel like, okay, now, God's not providing for us the way we think he ought to. They had that kind of idea, but God was there. God watched over them. God parted the sea. He went before them and behind them to lead them. And so he's been with them all the way. But again, I know last week we talked about it a little bit, but it has to do with these people's faith. Because like in verse 24 it says, "And the people murmured against Moses, saying, What shall we drink?" And so, God doesn't like when we murmur and complain all the time about what he's trying to do for us.
Right.
And, I think we do that today too. First of all, when you're a parent and you have children and all they want to do is complain or murmur about something constantly, it gets on your nerves after a while. And so you've got all these people, millions of people, and not only would it bother Moses, but you begin to see it's really bothering God. Right. Because as we read down through here, basically, Moses began to point out, who are we? Right. That him and Aaron. Well, no, you're murmuring to God. You might come and think it's to us. Right. But this is going to God.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. If you don't learn those kinds of lessons, John, I think you begin to see how we end up having an attitude of ungratefulness. And that's what you're seeing with them. And that's, it's interesting that in the New Testament, we're told to do all things without grumbling there in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. And one of the things about it is, number one, grumbling is contagious and destructive,
Yes.
And secondly, destructive. And third, that what grumbling does, it occupies the spirit of where you should be grateful for what has happened and where you are, but yet it takes up that space, and then you show an attitude of ingratitude. And that's what's annoying. And you used the example of with kids, because kids don't realize that it takes a lot to provide them what they have. And you are taking care of them, but they don't see that. And so it becomes, it's an immature mentality. Yeah. And because of that immature mentality, you don't grow as you should. Whereas usually when they get a little bit older and realize the difficulties that their parents had, then they, they understand. And then they develop this spirit of gratitude. Not everyone, not all of them, but the majority of them develop a spirit of gratitude. And you can see this and how destructive this was with Israel.
And, because of their murmuring, complaining about wanting something to drink, Moses goes and he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord said, basically, see that tree over there? He said, take it and cast it into the waters, because the waters were bitter. Right. And when he threw the tree in there, it became sweet, so that they could drink it. But another thing, at the same time, while they were, enjoying all this good water, we might say, it says there he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. And so once again, we're going to see this as you go right now. And we can say all through the Old Testament, but especially right now, you are going to keep seeing the word proved for a while, because as we said, this is what God's doing. He's doing these things to see how much faith they got. Just where are you people? And then he wants them, I think, too, to realize, I think, God's testing us. Right. And, we shouldn't be like this. But as we've been talking about, they should have been grateful. We can ask the question, well, was this a miracle? Well, it's really more than just a miracle that's taking place here. It's the Lord's way of teaching Israel, as we've been talking about, a great lesson, that they must constantly look to the Lord for divine guidance and instruction. And when we read and study this, it teaches us the same thing. It's no different for us today, that we must look to God.
That's right. Yes.
You don't go looking for the creeds of men or the teachings of men, the philosophies of men. You look and you ask yourself, well, what does God say about this? You got to seek God. You got to trust in the God for divine guidance and instruction. You got to seek His deliverance when we have affliction, when we have problems. And see, that's what's brought on here, some of these problems. And then, God tells them, hey, I'm proving these people.
Right, yes. Yeah, exactly.
So that's really something.
Yeah, and one other thing along with this grumbling aspect here, John, I think these things are also teaching us that we need to be the solution. As you're pointing out, we need to look to God. And that's the idea of the solution. And we need to be a solution-oriented people because problems are going to come up and challenges are going to face us. Now, do we sit back and complain, or do we look for the solution?
Right.
And when we go to God, that means we're looking for the solution. And God reveals or gives us what we need to help us to meet the challenge. And probably one of the things about the solution is to stay put and hunker down and follow what he says. That's one of the main solutions to any problem.
That's a good point, because that's what Moses was going on about when he said, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, and they were wanting to,
absolutely
murmur, complain, do all kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly.
So that goes along with that point you was making there. And verse 26 is kind of interesting too, because God says, if you'll listen to my voice and keep my commandments and do what I ask you to do, he says, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. And so, God says, I think in one sense God's saying, look, I'm with you. I'm going to help you. But don't get cocky and think that you're better than all the other nations, because you're not.
That's right. Yes.
But to show the people, or to demonstrate, he says, I tell you what, you get out of line, I'm going to put you back in line.
Right.
I'm going to cause these plagues to come on you.
Right.
And as you read and study the Old Testament, God kept His word.
Yes, He did.
Because they didn't, they quit listening unto God.
And their faith need to be developed to the point to it's like what Abraham does when God says, okay, you waited all these years for this son that I made promise that would be born to you. And then now what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and sacrifice him. And then what Abraham does, he immediately goes to do what God has commanded of him. And in his mind, he believed that God was going to raise him from the dead, that God had that power. Mm-hmm. Well, in this situation here, perhaps God, they should be thinking on that level. Perhaps God will sustain us, even though we're thirsting. And granted, yes, traveling in that wilderness like that, you do have you are going to be thirsty because of the way we are designed. And perhaps God is going to sustain us through this tremendous thirst that we're having. But I'm going to trust Him because He knows what is best. And that's that kind of faith that is really growing. And the Israelites, many of them are not to that point yet. And it's a growth process.
Sure. In the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 7 and verse 15, of course, in one sense, this is Moses' kind of farewell speech. It's his last instruction to the children of Israel before Joshua takes them into the promised land. But notice what he says here. He reminds them again, and the Lord will take away from thee all sickness, and will put none of the evil diseases of Egypt, which thou knowest, upon thee, but will lay them upon all them that hate thee. Now, here's what God can do for you. He can keep you from all this and turn around and put them on the the people that don't like you, the people that want to fight against you. And then another passage, and these all go together.
Yes.
In verse 58, again, this is coming down to the end of the chapter where Moses is going to have a conference with God, and he's not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. God breaks that news to him. But here it says, if thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God. And so once again, in verse 59, he said, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, every great plague, and of long continuance, and sore sickness, and not of long continuance. And so again, And you can read on down through. I mean, this continues for several verses about these, but we get the point. Again, God's telling them, you're going to have to listen to me and do what I say.
Right.
But we know that time and time again, Israel failed to do that.
Yeah.
They failed to listen there. One of the other things that I saw here, that in verse 26, he says, "For I am the Lord that healeth thee." I think that's an interesting statement in the sense that God don't want to have to bring plagues against anybody.
Right.
He doesn't want to see people die of disease or any of that stuff. See, God is saying here, I'm the one that can heal thee. God's the great healer.
Right.
And so I think that is important that, he already healed the waters.
Yes.
They couldn't drink it. And he said, okay, Moses. So we might say in one sense he healed them so they could drink.
Right.
And again, I think this goes back to this idea of proving the children of Israel.
Yeah.
So
many great lessons to learn. And that brings us to chapter 16, unless you have any other thoughts on that, John. The chapter 15 there at the end of the chapter there.
No.
Okay. Well, that takes us to the next crisis that comes up here in chapter 16. And here's this crisis that they're going to face is now hunger. So on one hand, you have the idea of thirst there in chapter 15, at the end of chapter 15. Now here in chapter 16, you have the hunger, because now they set out for Elim. And as they set out for Elim, it says, all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. And it says, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And so, again, that's that same thing, that they're murmuring or grumbling against Moses and Aaron, but in reality, they are grumbling and murmuring against God. Yeah. Because it's God who is directing Moses and Aaron to do what they're doing, and they're following God's instructions. So by grumbling towards Moses and Aaron, they are grumbling they're grumbling at God.
But when we look at this and you see they're grumbling or murmuring, these are people right now that are just not satisfied.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, they're not. Yeah. And we see people like that in life. Right. They're not satisfied. They're not content. They've always got to murmur and complain about something.
Right.
So.
And here's another lesson in that is those who would be preaching and teaching God's word, and we murmur or grumble against them teaching God's truth and what's revealed in His Word. Understand, we're not grumbling and murmuring against them. We're murmuring and grumbling against God. So that principle is established, firmly fixed here. And you see that with the children of Israel.
Another thing, I think this is the third time now they brought this up. Would to God, verse 3, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and did eat bread to the full. So here's this idea again, when they first told Moses there, when the Egyptian army, didn't we tell you back there we wanted to stay? You brought us out here to die. Yes. That was a dirty trick. Yeah. And that's like, it's just kind of like what I feel they're saying. Right. And then they do it again. Right. Hey, Moses, we still think this is a dirty trick you pulled. Now you're wanting to starve us to death.
And think about it. They murmured and grumbled when they were in slavery because God heard their cry. Yeah. And that's why he's answering to deliver them, because it's time. And now they're grumbling and murmuring now that they have freedom, they have liberty, and they are being led by an awesome and mighty God, but they don't see it.
That's right.
And that's what happens. It occupies all of that, and they fail to see that they're free. But instead, as you point out, they're comparing how they used to sit back and eat to full, but they were in slavery at the time. So it's astounding, but at the same time, we can easily fall prey to that as well.
Oh, sure.
And
I believe so.
and that's, I think it awakens us as we look at these examples, and in which Paul does as well, causing telling them to reflect back on this, and they would see that great lesson that comes from here. And this is what we're seeing. These are actual events that have taken place, and they have been recorded, that we can look at what goes on and how we are like that at times if we're not aware. And if we are, and we see ourselves like that, we need to understand we're being just like them. Because a lot of times people say, well, how could they do that when God has delivered them? Well, we do that too. A lot of times. So we need to be aware of that as well.
Another thing that I think is kind of, funny, I guess, in a way. Well, I know it's not really funny, but there in verse 3 at the end, he said, why have you brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly? Now look what they're saying they're going to be killed with: hunger.
Hunger.
Now it goes like this. It started with the Egyptians. Now it's water. Now it's hunger.
Right. Yes.
And I don't know. It's just unbelievable. But God, like you said a moment ago, God wants them to look at themselves, and they're not doing it.
Right.
They are so focused on them. Everything's about them.
Right. And then get down to verse 4. It says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. And so Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel at evening, You will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us? Or who are we? We're mere men. We're men just like you are.
Yeah.
And so we're following what God is telling us to do. And he is leading us this way, and we're following him. So why are you grumbling against us? In reality, again, you're grumbling against God.
Right. And I understand that Moses and Aaron, God put them in as leaders, but still... they have to answer to God too. Like you said, they're just men, but these people are really chewing them up and spitting them out.
Yeah. So. And there's no doubt. You can see, and the tension can be building as well, and between, even with Moses and Aaron, say, what are you can develop this anger against someone because they're constantly grumbling towards you when you're just following procedures or following instructions. And in this case, the ultimate instructor in God here. So it makes it very difficult.
And once again, we see this, where God talked about proving or testing these people.
Right.
They might not see that right now, but they are failing very miserably, I should say. God wanted to see if they'd walk in his ways, but they're not doing it.
Yeah, when God rains down the food from heaven, as he's going to do, number one, that's going to show that it is God who led them out of Egypt,
right?
Not some false god or whatever they might be thinking, but it's the true and living God. And secondly, they will see God's glory in this. You'll see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumbling. And understand, God is listening. God knows. We make a big deal about these new electronic devices that are listening, like Alexis and so forth. But understand, there is God who listens, God who hears, and we need to be careful on what we say and even our hearts and the type of attitude that we express. And so, because God heard that, but they were going to see his glory. And then that takes us down to the next section, or unless you have any other thoughts on that last section there.
Mine, no.
Okay.
We'll just go on.
All right. And then now it takes us, now Moses says, this will happen when the Lord gives you meat to eat. Notice, meat to eat. And he says, in the evening, and bread to the full in the morning, for the Lord hears your grumbling, which you've grumbled against him. And what are we? Your grumbling are not against us, but against the Lord. They had to be reminded again. Sort of like hard-headed children. You tell them once, and then you got to tell them twice, that this is what we're seeing here. And so he lets them know that they are grumbling against the Lord. And it says, and it came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And so it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like, fine as the frost on the ground. And when the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is bread. It is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather it every man as much as he should eat, and you shall take an omer apiece. That's about 2 quarts, we'll say that, to the number of portions of each of you has in his tent. So the sons of Israel did that, and some gathered much and some gathered little. But you can see the God providing the meat for them, the quail, and then also he provides the manna. And John, as we were talking a little bit about this earlier, and you had mentioned this was what Jesus was referring to back over there in John chapter 6 about God, the bread from heaven. And here God is providing this, which we will see that typifies.
As I recall, the Jews were trying to say that Moses provided that.
Right.
Jesus said more or less, I think you better go back and read that.
Right, exactly. Because it's the glory of God. That's right. It's the glory of the Lord that's being revealed in the sense of the provision of the food that's being given to them, that it was he who brought them out of Egypt.
And in all these things you just read, once again, God is testing the children of Israel. I'd written some things down here.
Okay, yeah.
As far as this testing is concerned, whether or not they would walk in God's laws. First of all, God wanted to see, it seems to me like, would they gather what God told them each day, or would they hoard it on some days because they did not completely trust God to provide more on the following days? And would they rest on the seventh day or go out searching for bread? Would they gather twice as much on the sixth day, when once they learned that any excess collected on other days spoiled after one day? And then I just dotted down these were God's tests, and just some of the things that when we look at this, maybe that'll help us to understand a little bit more. I hope why did God take the time and record this thing?
Right, absolutely.
And again, it's for our learning, and I think also we need to realize that whether we want to admit it or not. Some people say no, but we had this discussion a while back, and that's God's going to test our faith.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I think, and it doesn't matter what generation or what period you live in, whether it been the patriarchal, the Mosaical, or the Christian, there are going to be certain tests that God is going to use to prove us.
Right. That's right.
And then we got to look and say, oh, here's what God wants me to do.
That's right.
And then now my faith has to answer that. Okay? This is what you want me to do, God. You don't want me to murmur. I mean, that's in the New Testament. It goes to show how much God hates murmuring. So, God says, okay, now to you Christians, I don't want to hear no murmuring with you people.
Right, right.
And so, are we going to do it? Or are we going to be like them and overlook it? And like you said, we're just human, and we're no better than they were. And sometimes we do.
That's right.
So,
all right, my friends, our time is up.
Man, that was quick.
It sure was. But we invite you to come back and join us again next Thursday at 7 p.m. as we spend moments with the Master. And certainly it was good spending this time with you, and hope that you learned a lot. And we encourage you to tune in again next Thursday. But in the meantime, my friend, may God bless you as you continue to study His Word.
See you next week.